Hey, welcome into Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. It's good to have you. Dr. Charles Camarda is a distinguished NASA astronaut, 45 years with the NASA program, tons of experience. He's had a remarkable career and he's got a wonderful insights into the future of space exploration. He flew on the STS-114 return to flight mission following the Columbia disaster. Dr. Camarda is well, he's just one of the foremost experts in the field, a perfect person to talk to about the ongoing SpaceX Crew 10 rescue mission, launched just a few days ago to bring home astronauts stranded at the International Space Station since last year. NASA returned to the moon, maybe under the Artemis program. Are we going to Mars? And who's going to take us there, NASA or Elon Musk? It's all part of our great discussion coming up with Dr. Charles Camarda, author of Mission Out of Control, right here on Strictly Speaking. Dr. Camarda, it's good to have you. How you doing?
Great. How are you doing, Bob?
I am so excited. I'm great, thank you. And I'm so excited to talk to you now this particular week because of some extraordinary things going on in the space program. Some of them, I don't know. I guess it's great and it's wonderful that we're doing something, but not so much because we could have and probably should have done it months ago, and that maybe some politics got in the way of things. But that's where we're going to dive in today. So I'm really, really glad to have you at this particular moment in time. So, and we're going to talk about Mission Out of Control and your exemplary career in NASA and where we're going in the future. But what is your feeling right off the rip here about the International Space Station? We had a couple of astronauts who were supposed to be there for 8 days. 8 months plus later, they're still there, and it takes a civilian, a private space exploration company, Elon Musk's company, to somehow partner with NASA to get them home. What is going on?
Well, things happen. Almost every mission has issues. Things go wrong. We have contingency plans in place. We have backup systems. We have redundancies, but things always seem to go wrong. And that's what happened with the Starliner vehicle. It was an experimental vehicle. Butch and Sonny flew it up there as an experimental demo mission, and they had issues when they were getting ready to dock.
I like that you refer to them by their first names. You're friendly and colleagues of theirs.
Absolutely. They were hired a class after mine.
Okay, so what happened? What? I mean, when we say stranded, that's a loaded term. A lot of people have said, well, they're not stranded. Like you said, there are just some tech things that happened or whatever. But again, 8 days turned into 8 months. And so there's two aspects to that. I want to talk about NASA's capability of getting them down and why it is, because I don't know enough of the technical jargon or the understanding of the parameters of what it takes to go up there and to retrieve them, that they need to bring in Elon Musk. And then the second part of the question, Doctor, that I want to jump off right at the beginning here is, why did this not happen with Elon and his SpaceX rocket last fall? Because allegations are that the presidential administration in that time did not want to partner with Elon Musk, who was being very open about his support for then candidate Donald Trump, and that President Biden was concerned that relying on Elon Musk to get this done was going to look good for Trump and bad for him. What were politics at the center of why this has taken so long, in your opinion?
I really don't have the inside scoop. I don't have any firsthand intelligence on that, Bob. If I had to take a guess, I would suspect that Elon probably made the offer. Whether or not it was refused, why it was refused, I have no idea. I believe Elon would have done it for free.
I do too. I do too. When you're talking about, the richest man in the world who's spending billions of dollars
Yeah.
like it's nothing to him, I think he probably would have too, because I think he's really trying to do some positive things. But obviously, it took now, for whatever reason, until March here, the week of our conversation. They're actually scheduled to splash down tomorrow if everything goes according to plan. Can you talk about how the International Space Station works with respect to comings and goings? And again, why did NASA need the SpaceX rocket and Elon's assistance in all of this? We're talking about the most advanced space program in the history of the world, as I understand it. Why did NASA need anybody else's assistance anyway?
Well, ever since we retired the space shuttle, Bob, the U.S. hasn't had a means to getting human crew to orbit since 2011. Okay, now Elon Musk developed a vehicle that could fly humans to the International Space Station, and we started in 2020. And since then, Elon has launched 11 crews to space, a total of 40 astronauts to the International Space Station. And his vehicle is very reliable. And so that's why NASA went with the crew capsule, the Dragon capsule. They deemed the Starliner vehicle was not fit to return in. They didn't want to take the risk, and the reason why is because right before Butch and Sonny were getting ready to dock to the International Space Station, 5 out of the 28 RCS jets, those are the small thrusters that give accurate orientation and slowly position you for docking with the space station. 5 of them failed. And so they had to wait. They couldn't go close in and dock with the International Space Station. NASA had to do some testing. They fired the jets a couple of times. They got 4 of the 5 working, and the Starliner docked with the International Space Station.
Okay. So NASA ends the shuttle program in 2011, I think you said, right?
Correct.
Why do we, meaning the United States and NASA, why do we end the shuttle program without its successor being ready to go? Whatever it is that's going to be able to get crews into space, why we're relying on, private companies' rockets?
That is a very good question. You know, I flew STS 114 right after the Columbia accident. NASA was having many, many problems with space shuttle. It had lots of things wrong with it. Well, I shouldn't say lots of things. It had several major things wrong with it that it had to be retired. The big first and foremost, there was foam coming off the external tank that caused the Columbia accident, and it almost caused 2 near incidents, 2 near misses. My flight and the flight after us almost got hit with pieces of foam that could have caused critical damage. And so NASA had to retire the space shuttle. It was having problems with its wing leading edges, which is a special material that could withstand 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but it has a very thin coating. And if you chip that coating, just a thumbnail sized chip, you burn up when you come through the Earth's atmosphere. These are very special components. They didn't have spares. They didn't have enough spares. The material wasn't being made before. The space shuttle needed to be retired after we completed the space station. That was its mission.
How did you feel getting on the first shuttle after Columbia? I mean, did you have full utmost confidence that you were going to be fine? I mean, you said you had a near miss as it was.
Yeah, yeah. I talk about that in the first half of my book also. And so I was fine with flying on the next mission. You know, I never thought I was going to be selected because I was raising so much hell within the agency about safety. But I was selected. And a matter of fact, me and several colleagues invented things that we flew in space to repair our vehicle in case we would get into trouble. The reason why I flew is because number one, the risk was always going to be the same with space shuttle. The probability of us losing a crew in a space shuttle is about 1 in 67. It's a very dangerous vehicle to fly. I signed on to fly in space, knowing those odds. I knew the odds would probably be better on our mission because we had developed a lot of new technology to help us inspect the vehicle and possibly repair the vehicle if we had any damage, if we saw any damage.
Why did you get into the space program? Little kids sometimes, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a cowboy. What about you? I want to be an astronaut. What about it's a thing kids say, but it's very, very, very few people actually do that. Did you always know that you wanted to go to space?
You know, I'm one of those geeky kids since I was 7, 8 years old. I always wanted to be an astronaut. I grew up during the Cold War, Sputnik, us against the Russians. I looked at those silver suited Mercury 7 astronauts. They were my heroes. I always wanted to be one. And I love science and engineering my whole life. And so that's what guided me in that direction.
So it's one thing to be fascinated and to see the silver suited heroes, and it's another thing to be able to understand engineering. It's another thing to get into NASA, to get into the program, and to be able to go into space. Um, what was that like? What I mean, what because again, to have a dream is one thing, but to actually carry it out step by step, going to school for it, and whatever else it took, that's another thing altogether. Take us through that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I grew up in Ozone Park, Queens. My dad was a little neighborhood butcher shop, a family butcher shop. Him and my uncle. My mom always stressed education. It was critical. Went through parochial school up through my high school in Archbishop Malloy. And then I entered Brooklyn Polytech in aerospace engineering. And it was when between my junior and senior year, that I had an internship at NASA Langley Research Center, that made me understand that what I really wanted to do was I wanted to be a researcher, and I wanted to work in high temperature structures for hypersonic vehicles.
That's pretty specific. That's pretty narrow. And you just and that was just something that you gravitated toward in your studies?
Well, what happens is, and I say this to a lot of students I talk to, get as many internships as you possibly can to really understand. Well, you're learning so many different subjects related to engineering. Which one do you want to focus on? But I was mentored by some of the top people in the world in aerothermodynamics, in heat transfer, and structural mechanics. And looking at these people and then being able to actually get selected to get hired by NASA. And I got to choose exactly where I wanted to work. And the thing that inspired me was this epic challenge of how do we fly vehicles 25 times the speed of sound, very high heating, very high loads. How do we design structures that survive that?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that, especially particularly regarding the lunar programs and lunar missions and things like that. But what year did you graduate, and what year did you get hired in?
I graduated and got hired at NASA in 1974.
Okay, so 12 years later, which is not to date you or me, but my senior year of high school is when the Challenger happened in 1986. So
That's
where were
correct.
you in the program at that time? And take me through that. What was that like for you?
Sure thing. I know exactly where I was. I was driving back to work after lunch at NASA Langley Research Center. I was working as a research engineer for 22 years there. We worked on thermal protection systems, just like the shuttle tiles. We were designing things and testing things for Space Shuttle. While I was an engineer there, I realized that we lost Challenger, and I immediately went to work, started watching it on TV, started talking to folks, trying to understand what caused the rocket motors to basically set fire to the external tank.
So that's technical stuff. Tell me how that hit you. Tell me what it was like to be in NASA at the time when that
Well,
televised disaster. I mean, I can tell you where I was. As I mentioned to you, I was a senior in high school, and I was in a class. It was an elective class called Current Events. It was kind of a new course. Our social studies teacher slash assistant principal, who hated me because I was kind of a screwball, uh, was in charge of that class. We had the TV wheeled in on one of those big giant carts like we used to do,
exactly.
and
Up in the air, yeah.
yep, you got it. And they wheeled it in so we could watch the launch. Of the Challenger. It was just like, current events was the name of the class. And we were going to do that and discuss a little bit about the shuttle program and everything else. So I saw it happen live in my classroom is when when it broke apart in the air like that. So I mean, the shock and the stunning nature of that was incredible for us. But I want to know what it was like for you. You're NASA and you see that happen. Give me the emotional side.
Sure. If I could, Bob, that was a long time ago for me. Can I tell you how I felt when I watched Columbia happen?
You can do both of those things, sure.
Sure. Well, I was training in Russia when we found out that Columbia we lost Columbia during Earth entry, right? And I remember the cosmonaut coming across the common area at Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center telling us the news. It hit us hard. We went into our cottages, we turned on the TV, and we started watching the launch video, looking at this huge piece of foam come off the vehicle and obviously strike the underside of the left wing of Space Shuttle Columbia. At first, of course, we were devastated. We were sad. We were in shock. But then it became rage for me, Bob, because that was my area of expertise. And what I couldn't understand was how really good, supposedly good engineers, researchers at Johnson Space Center, flight directors, program managers make such a terrible decision. Not know that this huge piece of foam striking very fragile thermal protection system did not cause damage. So I became enraged, and I stayed that way. I know my daughter called me. She used to babysit Laurel Clark's son, Ian, and she was in tears. She was crying. She was a teenager. It was terrible.
Yeah. So you're enraged, and you're all trying to figure out what happened. And when you know what happened, it makes you even more enraged because I mean, what you're saying is basically it was preventable. This was something that should have not happened.
Absolutely, it was preventable. We knew large pieces of foam were coming off the external tank ever since the very first flight in 1981. We had about 45 pieces of this same piece of foam from the bipod ramp come off the vehicle during launch. No one at Johnson Space Center did the analysis to understand what would happen if that foam struck the orbiter. They they did not, even though they had experts at Langley Research Center and Glenn Research Center that could have helped them. They did not choose to select a team and try to understand what an impact of a large piece of foam would do if it struck the thermal protection system.
Why? Why do you think that is? I mean, you knew
I,
it. You were
I,
afraid of it.
I,
They didn't
I
test it.
explained.
They didn't figure it out. Why? It's NASA.
Yeah, yeah, and it's NASA, and that's why I wrote the first half of my book to show you how ugly it is behind the scenes at NASA. Everyone thinks NASA is this shining castle on a hill, but they have been degraded. They went from a research culture to a production culture. They stopped funding applied research. They stopped talking to the people at the research centers. Eventually, we start losing our research capability. People at Johnson Space Center kind of surround themselves and isolate themselves and thought that they understood everything about the problem. And when they didn't know something, they didn't raise their hand and say, I don't know. We need to bring in another expert. That speaks to something that's called psychological safety. People are afraid to speak up. People are afraid to admit they don't know something. That's not a research culture, and that's what I talk about.
So, mission out of control is long before the mission. Actually, I mean, this is out of control from the jump because what you're talking about is the whole culture was changed. When did that begin? When did it start to shift from a research, you know, organization to a production organization?
Absolutely. I go through that history, basically starting with NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. We had just three small research centers doing applied research and then transferring that research to our aircraft industry after World War I. So the United States would have the best airplanes in the world. Now, as soon as Apollo started, we started growing the program. It became a huge program. We had hundreds of contractors. Engineers were not doing hands on research. They were farming it out. They were looking over the shoulder at what contractors are doing. And right after, and so we started Apollo by taking those, literally the DNA, those critical researchers, and bringing them to Johnson Space Center, bringing them to Marshall Space Flight Center, Kennedy Space Flight Center. And so it was that transition. The early leaders at NASA during Apollo, during the space program, came from the research centers, and they were technically very, very sharp. The Werner von Brauns, the Bob Gilroots, the Max Fages, they didn't have to go three levels down within the organization to understand the technical details of a problem. They could tell you when someone was presenting something to them if it was wrong, and they could ask the tough questions and dig deep.
See, I'm in a really tough place right now, doctor, because you mentioned, you know, everybody sees NASA as the shining beacon and so forth. And I mean, I think back to what was the Bruce Willis one, Armageddon. when the asteroids coming, or the comet or whatever was coming, and it's going to be a global killer or whatever. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drill. And he said, that's it. He said, that's your answer. He said, you guys are NASA. You guys think this shit up. That's the best you can come up with. That's how we all feel. It's like, you're NASA. How can you not know about foam, chipping off and hitting the orbit? How can you not know these things? How do you not have all of that stuff, double and triple and quadruple redundancy covered, because you're NASA. We think you guys are supposed to have all of this crap. And it sounds like NASA's been degraded in a really great way.
And no one would believe it. And as much as it pained me, because I love NASA and I stayed there for 13 years after I was reassigned, because I was trying to fix NASA, I was trying to help NASA. I have all this experience. But when you think about it, they could never solve the foam problem. A large piece of foam almost down Columbia. We as a crew, before we flew, asked them to take this other large piece of foam called a protuberance airload ramp, a power ramp, off before we launched. NASA told us not to worry about it. There was a 1 in 10,000 chance that it would ever come off. Guess what happened when we launched?
It came off.
It came off, flew under our left wing, or our left wing. And if it would have hit our wing, it would have been worse than the impact that downed Columbia. And not only that, when I was director of engineering after I flew, Mike Griffin, the administrator of NASA, wanted me to become director of engineering to change the culture there. I had to stand up at the flight readiness review for the very next mission and say, we're not ready to launch. There are other pieces of foam which need to come off. And I had to do that right after my center director had already announced that Johnson Space Flight Center was go for launch. Then right after I stood up, the chief engineer of NASA stood up and said, Charlie's right. We need to not launch. We need to take those pieces of foam off. And another astronaut who was the head of safety and mission assurance, Brian O'Connor, stood up and said we shouldn't launch. And we did. We launched. That was the first time we ever launched with 2 items in the red box in the risk reliability matrix, meaning it was the event that the foam would come off and cause damage was highly likely. And if it caused damage, it would be critical. And the administrator overruled what everyone else said, all those good technical people, and he said, we're going to launch. And the foam did come off and almost struck that wing leading edge.
So how infuriated were you when that happened? Because you knew ahead of time, you saw it, you knew exactly, you argued it, and then there was the argument made, don't launch, they launch anyway. You're a part of that. Your life is in jeopardy there.
Not only that, but I was fired 3 days after that. So this supposedly new organization right after Columbia is now totally not psychologically safe. They're firing people that are telling them something's wrong, and they're silencing their voices. And the same thing is happening today. And so I wanted to explain that in the book because I wanted people to understand that NASA did not change its culture. It's worse than it ever was. And the second half of the book talks about, well, how do we solve this problem? And I go through in detail my ideas for how we could solve this problem.
Yeah, and that's extraordinarily important. Let's throw that book cover up on the screen again there, Mission Out of Control, just so everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. What you're describing right now, Dr. Camarda, it's depressing. It's disconcerting just as a regular layman, in America, and proud of our space program and everything else, because I feel like we are further behind where we were during the moon program in the 60s. And that can't be. Because and you know what you're doing. I had one of the moon landing deniers on this program a few months back, and we were talking about all of the different things. And the one thing that he's right about is that I can absolutely say is the tech between then and now is like ridiculous. It's like then you had a pocket calculator, and now you've got an advanced supercomputer. We all do in the form of our cell phones here. Tech has advanced so much. You would think that NASA and the program would be just as advanced. It would be like traveling to the moon now, what are we looking at? 65 years, 60 years, whatever it is, since the landing. traveling to the moon and back now would be like, hopping on a cross-continental flight from New York to LA. We'll be back in a little while because we did it in the 60s with such a minuscule amount of the tech that we have now. Why the hell can't we do it now? And from everything your book discusses and what you're talking about, it's because NASA is not what it once was.
That's right. And there were two reasons for that, Bob. Right? I talk about in the book how we lost our research culture. We don't have a large number of young and senior engineers that were brought up in this research culture know how to conduct a research quality test and analysis. Okay, that's one thing. So we're seriously missing key critical subject matter experts. The other thing is we have a toxic environment, a toxic culture where people are afraid to speak up. This is exactly the reason for the 737 MAX failures. People knew there were issues. They tried to speak up. They were silenced. And in some cases, their careers suffered.
What's the reason? Who was silencing you guys? Who fired you?
Well, the person that fired me was another astronaut. The head, he was the center director. Michael Coates was the center director at Johnson Space Center. He stood up and said we should fly. We'd go for launch. I stood up right after him. He wouldn't listen to his own engineering director and his engineering team that were trying to tell him we're not ready to fly. And he said we're ready to fly. Now, he will tell you he fired me for other reasons, and I totally understand that if he wants to say that. But really, it's the production culture. Remember, Shuttle was designed to build the International Space Station. And so we're we're in the process of constructing the International Space Station. We're under schedule and budget pressure. Charlie Camarda is standing up saying, hey, we could fly safer. You just have to take your time and fix some of these problems. And the program managers who have this much power compared to the engineering organization totally overpower them and silence them. The engineers were afraid to speak up. The one engineer that did speak up, Rodney Rocha, was saying we should take pictures on orbit to see what the damage is. He was immediately silenced and shut down. And that shouldn't happen in a healthy environment.
No.
And what I'm saying is NASA is worse now than it was during Columbia and post-Columbia.
That's incredible. So if and I'm going to go big picture again here. When was the last Apollo mission? 72?
Correct.
72.
Yeah,
right?
around that time, yes.
So 53 years later, we have not resurrected the moon program. And now we're being told Artemis, we're going to go back there next year. I mean, obviously we've put things on the moon. I'm talking about manned flight, but again, from a technical standpoint, that should not be that difficult anymore. But what you're describing right now in the culture, not listening to researchers like you, the director of research, the toxic environment that's silencing all voices and so on and so forth, it makes one wonder, is the reason we haven't resurrected it because we can't? Given all of the obstacles that sound like they're self-created. It's not like the technology to go to the moon doesn't exist anymore, but yet the ability is somehow gone, and it sounds like it's almost self-created problem.
You're absolutely right, Bob. We lost our mojo, but it's a very slow process. One of the chapters I labeled "Boiling a Frog," and I go through this 30 years and how we lost this capability to the point where we're struggling to even build a rocket to go back to the moon. And when you look at the architecture and what it will take to get us to the moon, it's ludicrous. People that are laughing at NASA right now when they look at the Artemis program and the architecture. We would have to use 20 Starship launches just to fuel a Starship to go to an orbiting space station around the moon just to bring the Starship there. Then you launch the SLS vehicle, which is $4 billion a launch, only launches twice a year. That will bring the crew to the space station. They get on Starship and they land on the moon. 20 launches just to fuel it to get to the space station orbiting the moon. And Starship is having problems also. It's not just NASA. And so this was a very bad architecture. As a matter of fact, we're struggling. The Artemis program is struggling, and I raised this as a major issue. and was shot down by NASA because their heat shield that they're using had serious problems. They couldn't even replicate the heat shield that we used during Apollo that returned from the moon successfully 6 times,
How is
7 times.
How is that? How can that be? How can they not be able to replicate something in 2025 that they did in 1969, 70, 71, 72?
You're asking a very good question. Some of the material properties changed, the constituents in the ablative material changed, but NASA made a very bad decision. They did an experimental launch called EFT-1, which went around the Earth and landed through the Earth's atmosphere using an Apollo-like heat shield. Apollo-like heat shield had honeycomb core filled with this goop that was a silicon type material that was the ablative material. Had to be hand filled using a cork gun in about 300,000 different honeycomb cells. So the process was laborious. It was tough to be consistent, but NASA did it successfully on numerous Apollo missions, and EFT-1 was successful. But for some reason, a program manager in the Artemis program decided they were going to change from that procedure to just put large blocks of this Avcoat material, about 80 to 100 of them, and glue them to the bottom of the heat shield because it would save money and they could do it quicker.
So,
And when it returned on Artemis 1, 100 large pieces, 100 large chunks came out as it was coming through the plasma during Earth entry, flew off the vehicle. NASA refused to post those pictures online. They were covering it up. It took the Office of Inspector General to basically bring what those photographs look like, how badly the damage was.
So you say NASA can't even build a rocket that can get out there anymore. SpaceX is building rockets. Obviously, the one that just went up there to rescue these astronauts at the station, your friends. And what did you think when Elon Musk designed this? He and his team of engineers and people like you managed to bring a rocket back down and be caught by those arms, those mechanical arms, right back to the launch point where it took off from. It was like one of the most amazing feats of engineering marvels that I've ever even imagined. And I don't have an engineering mind. I go wide eyed at anything, but that was incredible. I think even probably for somebody like you.
No, absolutely. But remember, we were trying to do that back when I was a young engineer. We were talking about designing flyback boosters from Space Shuttle that were liquid fueled that could land at the SLS back at the Cape. We were talking about doing this. NASA is not able to do this because they still use old school product development methods, right? When we were a young research center at Langley Research Center, we were the ones that led the first Mars landing. Those Viking landers, those 2 landers were done with a small team of researchers from NASA Langley, not the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So we have the capability to do amazing things with few people and do it quickly if you understand how researchers do this, how to fail smart, fast, small, cheap, early and often, looking at multiple ideas simultaneously, rapidly accelerating those ideas and picking the ones that are most successful.
Okay. So what you just said is key, though. We were thinking about that stuff. We were talking about it. Didn't do it. Can't do it. If it weren't for the private space companies and the exploration programs, the Starships and SpaceX, and so if it weren't for them, is NASA getting anything done anymore? Do they have that capability without the private research and experimentation that's going on?
Well, they're struggling. They're struggling a lot, Bob. You talk about they can build a rocket, but look at the rocket they built. It uses the same technology, the same 1970s technology that we used to design and build the space shuttle. And the only component of it that we designed that could be fully reusable was the orbiter and the space shuttle main engines. They're using those same space shuttle main engines. They took off the orbiter, but they're throwing those reusable engines away. So you tell me, it's not progressing technology.
No, it's not.
It's not advancing. our
You know,
knowledge.
and they're speaking of throwing stuff away again. Going back to the moon landing denying crowd, you know, they talk about the reports, and I don't remember exactly how they came about or whatever, that so much of the technical schematics and everything else that was done to get us to get the Apollo program going and to get us there was destroyed after the last mission, after 72. So much of it is gone forever. Is that accurate? Because that's what they say, and I haven't heard anybody say that it's not accurate. I've just heard people say dismissing it, saying it doesn't matter.
I'm not sure how accurate that is. We didn't have the digital technology like we have today. And so a lot of it were reports that people had to dig through. And so we may have lost some of that information. I'm positive we must have. For instance, for the heat shield,
How does that
people
happen,
are
though? If I may, and again, the crowning achievement of humankind, arguably, scientifically, was landing on the moon, particularly when Kennedy says it in 60, and by the end of the decade, and the race is on, and we beat the Russians and we make it happen. It's like impossible. You're right. We didn't have digital technology to store all of that stuff. Why? I cannot imagine that stuff isn't put inside of a Fort Knox and inside of another Fort Knox so that it can never, ever be stolen, lost, or tampered with. And when it's time to resurrect the program or take the next step from Apollo to Mars or whatever the case might be, we're going back here and we're pulling all that other stuff that worked in the 60s and 70s, and we're going to build upon it in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and so forth, right? How the hell is that stuff not all archived?
we should have put it in that mine shaft where they had all those documents from OPM.
Yeah, there you go. I know it's a little bit jokey, but I mean, right? I mean, the stuff should have been stored
No,
someplace
no,
where it didn't have any
you're
touch.
absolutely right.
I mean, who just
You're
kind of says, "Oh, I
absolutely right.
lost the schematics for the lander and or the heat shield or whatever"? Oh, what did we do on that again? Geez, oh Pete, you know, he used it to go to the moon with human beings, and now 50 years later, we don't got that stuff anymore. I'll never get that. I'll never understand that.
That's a very good point. And one story about the heat shield, when these engineers were trying to dig back in to understand how we did it during Apollo, they actually saw that the people back during Apollo had the same idea of trying to go to a block half-coat heat shield. They tested it, it cracked, it failed, and they said, we can't do that. We're going to use the honeycomb-filled heat shield. But they didn't do their research before they designed it or made this new decision to go to block F code. See, that's the difference
Because they
between a
fired their
research.
director of research. That's why they didn't do
Well,
their research, because they don't have the right researchers there anymore.
but that's the difference between a research engineer and an engineer. It's like a PhD student. You look at everything that's been done before you write your dissertation. You dig. You drag out everything. You look at every which way somebody else tried to solve this problem. They did not do that. They don't have that thirst for knowledge that real researchers have. They're good engineers, but the difference between a research engineer and a good engineer is a good engineer will tell you what tools he used or she used to give you an answer or what tests they conducted. A research engineer will tell you everything that they know. A research engineer will tell you everything they don't know, what they don't know about this problem, and what is missing or what their assumptions are in the tools you're using when you solve this problem and what you have to watch out for. They test things to failure, and they're not satisfied until they understand how things fail.
So let's talk about Mars. You know, NASA has been, just giving a little bit of lip service to it here and there. Certain individuals, presidents have kind of mused upon it. We're going to go to Mars. President Trump is like all about it. And Elon, of course, has now made a proclamation saying we're going to send a SpaceX rocket to Mars next year in 2026. And I think he said the goal of a human, what do I call it?
Mission?
Manned mission is what I'm trying to say. A manned mission to Mars, I think by 2030, 4 years later. Possible, in your opinion, based on what your knowledge of SpaceX and or NASA's capabilities are?
I think we could send humans around Mars right now, today, if we wanted to. I mean, it would take several years to design the vehicle, and Elon still has to prove out the Starship vehicle. But I think it's absolutely possible. Landing humans on the surface of Mars will be a lot more difficult. Um, yes.
More difficult than the moon?
Oh, absolutely more difficult than the moon. But here's the thing, before I retired from NASA, I was trying to tell them, you know what, look at what I've done with these other experts to show you how to fix NASA, right? When they were trying to go to the moon, I said, if we don't fix NASA right now, and we have this mission to go to the moon without transforming NASA, we could very likely lose the next space race to the moon to the Chinese. We're better off setting our sights on Mars because we know we could get to Mars before the Chinese. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now and the issues we're having getting to the moon could very well be that the Chinese might be able to make inroads and possibly even beat us to put boots on the ground on the surface of the moon. And that would be devastating.
Yeah. Do you mean the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars?
Oh, the surface of the moon.
Okay.
And so
Because we
rather
talked
than
about, you
go,
said the Chinese are going to beat us to Mars too.
oh, no, 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 no. I think we would have, if we would have set our sights on Mars and made that the next space race, the Chinese couldn't beat us to Mars, but they could
Why
beat
is
us
that?
to the
Why
moon.
is that, do you think? Because we tend to think of the Chinese as being so advanced educationally because, you got scores of Chinese students coming here to study in the States. They can't speak English, and yet they get, 36s on their ACTs and they get straight A's and everything else. I mean, it's really a different culture, their focus on education. I assume that translates into technological advancements as well, including space.
Oh, absolutely. My area of expertise was hypersonics. And back in 74, when I was working at NASA Langley, we were working on hypersonics program. No question, the United States was far ahead of everyone else in hypersonics. That's traveling faster than 5 times the speed of sound. Many of these things are traveling 10, 20, 25 times the speed of sound. Right now, the Chinese and the Russians have operational hypersonic weapons, and the United States does not. And that troubles me tremendously. We're rapidly trying to catch up.
Wow. How did we fall behind in that race?
Exactly for the same reason
Same
I
things?
told them. We stopped investing at NASA in advanced research.
And started producing instead. Yeah.
We started gutting advanced research to fund these bloated, very expensive human space programs.
So you did mention Russia there when you talked about the hypersonics, speed of sound technology. I was wondering because you mentioned China, China, China. You didn't say anything about Russia. You also didn't mention India. Are they a player at all in the space race?
In the space race per se, yeah, they will be putting people in space very soon, and they will catch up. They will be viable. I don't think they're as advanced in hypersonics technology.
Okay. Why do you think the Chinese have not passed us though? Like I said, given what they do and what they are and what they have focused on, and we have. I mean, it sounds like we were here, they were here, and while they've advanced and NASA has kind of, like you said, it's stagnated to be gentle about it, and been compromised in terms of its goals and its advancement to be a little bit more harshly critical. Why is China not ahead of us yet?
Well, they are putting rovers on the surface of the moon,
Right,
right?
rovers.
They rovers on the surface of the moon, and it takes a while before they'll put humans. I think they're talking about 2030. They intend to put Chinese taikonauts on the surface of the moon, so that takes a while. But they're very methodic in how they're planning this. The rovers are exploring the places they want to search for ice and water, just like our landers are
Mhm.
trying to do. Right now, we have 1 out of 3 landers that was successful. The Blue Ghost lander is currently on the surface of the moon. I don't know if it's still operational, looking for places where they can mine for water and understanding the surface properties of the regolith and how we could use that to do construction. I think one of the next missions, the next robotic missions that the Chinese are going to do, they're actually going to try to build bricks on the surface of the moon using regolith. And that was in our plans to do with our moon landers, but they may be advanced ahead of us. They
There we go
may.
again. There it is again. Well, we talked
Yeah, yeah.
about it. It was in our plans to, have the I forgot what you called it, but the rocket return to its where the SpaceX rocket was supposed
Flyback
to.
boosters. We were looking
Yeah,
at
thank you,
flyback
thank you.
boosters.
We
Yeah.
talked about it. We didn't do it. They did. We talked about this too, but the Chinese are going to be the ones doing it. It's really remarkable and really really disturbing, quite frankly. Um, why is Mars different though? You two things. You said Mars, the challenge of landing on Mars is going to be much greater than landing on the moon was. And then when I asked you about China winning that race, you meant back to the moon for them, back to the moon for us. But and then I said Mars. You said, oh no, they wouldn't be anywhere near that. Tell me why, if they are advanced in the moon, capabilities, and perhaps going to beat us there in 2030. What about Mars? Why is that a different game for them?
We are one of the few countries that have successfully landed multiple rovers on the surface of Mars.
Mhm.
Mars has an atmosphere. It's a very thin atmosphere, but when you have a vehicle going through the Mars atmosphere, you have to protect it from the heat, just like you do during entry through Earth's atmosphere. So you have that to worry about. Mars atmosphere is very thin. So to slow it down, how do you slow it down? If you slow it down propulsively, you have to use that propellant to slow it down, just like the Elon Musk boosters coming back
Yeah,
and landing vertically. But the other option is to have what they call a balloon. You throw this giant balloon-like structure that's very large, so it slows you down with the friction against the very not so dense atmosphere of Mars.
like a
Um,
dragster, like a race with the parachute that comes out the back.
exactly, except it's in front of you. It's also providing some thermal protection. Plus, you have a 20 to 40-minute communication delay. So everything has to be totally autonomous. Within to the moon, it's maybe a second or two delay. It's still autonomous landing. Okay. And we should be able to nail this down. I mean, we've done this on Mars multiple times. JPL is doing a phenomenal job, one of the few centers within NASA that's still doing advanced work. Unfortunately, though, NASA's starting to gut even JPL. They've gutted all the research centers, the three research centers. Now you're seeing cuts being made to JPL. And this is really devastating, I believe. We need to be concerned about this.
I was listening to Elon on Joe Rogan a few weeks ago, and it was a fascinating conversation about some of the SpaceX stuff. And he's talking about populations. He's talking about taking the first steps because the resources on this planet are not guaranteed to survive, to allow us to survive into whatever that future looks like. If he's talking about 100 years or 200 years, long after we are all gone, somebody is going to have to lay the groundwork to, allow humanity to survive on something that isn't the Earth. Um, do you share that feeling that that is something that should be explored? And do you feel like it's possible, even several lifetimes from now, several generations into the future, where we could look back to the 2010s, 20s, and 30s, and this, exploration of Mars, and we're able to finally figure out the landing and so on and so forth, and eventually populate another planet? Or is this all science fiction?
No, I think a multi-planet species and looking at that as a goal, as a vision, it's epic. I think it's necessary. It'll only take one extinction event like this large asteroid
Right.
that might be flying by Earth, and so if you want to, we might not have millions of people on the surface of the planet when an extinction event happens. But how many will it take to actually have a sustainable colony? And to maintain that colony. And that's what people are looking at. And how do you build that colony, that community? And how do you produce food? How do you produce consumables, hydrogen, oxygen, water? Um, so these are all questions that a lot of people are looking at right now. They're playing with ideas for doing that and thinking that we could do that on the lunar surface in preparation for going to Mars. And I think that would be smart. But I think we should do it robotically. We're spending way too much money putting humans in the loop when we should be doing these things robotically. Because if we're going to send people to Mars, we need to send robots first that basically create the landing sites, create the fuel depots, create the consumables depots, so that when we send the first crews there, they will have fuel to come back.
Which is more likely that would be colonized by a human civilization, the lunar surface or Mars?
Oh, definitely Mars, I think, would be more,
So the
would be
lunar,
easier to
okay.
make habitable.
And
Yeah.
it because you said there's an atmosphere, a thin one, but an atmosphere. Do we know enough about it to know whether it's something that could support life, human life?
Well, it can't support life. The atmosphere can't support life. So we will have to create habitats or basically build those habitats in lava tubes on the surface of these planets, or
So
to be
domes,
able to.
basically. When you say, I mean, basically we'd have to create our own atmosphere and
A- Absolutely.
wow.
And so we're looking at doing that, and we're looking at experimenting with that. That's why the Chinese are looking at creating bricks. Basically, it's called in situ resource utilization. It's living off the land, just like our pioneer ancestors, right? Looking at the regolith, looking at how we could use the regolith to build shelters that have radiation protection, and how do we seal these shelters? Um, and to do that before we send the humans there to do it,
Um,
to live.
do you spend a lot of time online, social media sites and things like that?
Do I,
Do you
excuse
spend
me,
a lot of time on social media websites, on X and on Facebook or any of those kinds of things?
I probably do, but not too much. I do tend to try to pick up what people are talking about.
Yeah, the reason I ask is for those of us who do, which I'm ashamed to say I'm one of them because it's part of what I do. But my algorithms, where they feed you targeted content in all of these different platforms, I see a ton of flat earther discussions. It's 2025. I didn't think this existed anymore, that people were still tried to make an argument and a case that the earth is flat and it's under. What made me think of it is when you talked about a dome type of atmosphere creation on Mars. That's what they claim is something called a firmament, sort of a dome type of thing. And they claim that everything as far as outer space is a myth. We've never left low Earth orbit and so on and so forth. I didn't know if a person like you, with all of your expertise, sees any of that stuff. Do you chuckle at it when you do, or do you get on there and say, here's what you people don't know and here's the reality of it? Is it something in NASA and space engineers like you that you guys engage in?
I give up on trying to transform how some people think, especially in politics, and also some folks like these flat earthers and Apollo landing deniers. Um, I tend to not spend too much time
Okay.
thinking about it. But even people like on Reddit, for instance, that were talking about the EM drive, and there was a lot of hype about the EM drive and cold fusion, and was thrust really produced or not. And my friends were saying, Charlie, there was a NASA scientist that said this is true. And I said, I really think you need to look at the experiments they're doing. They're not probably monitoring the properties that they're trying to measure accurately enough to determine if you have a net thrust. And I pretty much don't believe anyone has this debunked the second law of thermodynamics. And so I didn't believe it. And then eventually people started to realize that it wasn't true. But you have a lot of really smart people. And if you don't know what they're saying, you can tend to be made to be a believer.
Yeah.
But there are only a few laws that haven't been debunked yet. I mean, conservation of mass momentum and energy, we've Newtonian mechanics doesn't work when we're getting close to the speed of light, yada yada yada. But the first and second laws of thermodynamics, they're pretty much solid right now.
Yeah, but you know what? That's the reason I asked, because to be truthful, the internet needs people like you, because those people are out there. They are smart and they know how to present things a certain way that will make the layman just look and say, oh my gosh, yeah, it's real. I mean, they're right, because or maybe they may not be right, but boy, there's no explanation for A, B, C, or D. Guys like you have the explanation. I didn't know. That's why I wondered if you ever engaged with those kinds of things online or not, because it's important uh, to expose people who are, indeed very
They
smart,
they
but
they
trying to
wouldn't
voice what's
believe
real
me.
for us.
Bob, they wouldn't believe me, Bob, just like the people at NASA didn't believe me when I told them they were broken. Before they were trying to determine whether or not they would fly Artemis 2, I tried to get them to read my book. I tried to talk to them how broken it was, and they basically told me they didn't believe me.
Well, you just kind of ventured into the last subject I wanted to talk to you about, and that is where does the future of NASA go from here? Because mission out of control, you're exposing the, I don't want to be overly dramatic when I say the deterioration of NASA, the deterioration of the space program, but it sounds like that's what it is. And that a lot of it is intentional, or at the very least, it's very irresponsibly happening because they're not taking steps that guys like you are recommending to fix it. Uh, doesn't sound like they have any interest in going back.
Well, think about it, Bob. It took me 10 to 15 years to understand behavioral science, sociology, to read this literature, dozens of books, hundreds of technical papers, talk to these people to understand what culture is all about and to understand how it plays a critical role in how these organizations fail and we lose lives. The Columbia accident investigation was the first investigation in the world that determined that the culture of NASA was the primary cause of the accident. Then we have the 737 accidents, two of them, Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air, almost in less than a year. And people are saying the cause of that accident was deterioration of Boeing's culture from one that was geared towards technical excellence, safety, learning, to all of a sudden a product development, a production type of a culture where schedule and budget ruled everything. Voices were canceled. You had whistleblowers whose voices were canceled, who really said there were problems with the company, but people didn't listen to them. They were silenced. I heard these people.
Well, that's the best answer to the question is whether or not we're going to restore the program to its former glory, and the answer is no. If they're canceling and silencing those who are willing to point out the problems and what caused it to spin out of control.
I think, Bob, we have one last chance. I think if Jared Isaacman gets selected, I don't know if he's the right one, but at least he's a different thinker. He's an entrepreneur like Musk. He'll have different ideas. Maybe he'll be open to bringing the right people to explain to him how badly this is and can show him how to fix this problem. When before I retired, I went to NASA with the 60-page paper. I had several technical experts from Boeing around the country and even from Finland went to headquarters and said, "This is how I believe we could fix NASA and make it well again." And they blew us off. I'd be happy to share that with anyone that wants to read that document, and also with Jared Isaacman if he's selected to be the next administrator.
Where would somebody read that document?
Well, it's right now it's on my file on my computer, but I could definitely upload it onto LinkedIn. I could upload it to a server and make everyone read
You
it.
have a website that promotes Mission Out of Control or anything like that where it could be put there?
I do. I could put it on my website, charliecamarda.com.
Okay.
We also have missionoutofcontrolbook.com, but I would probably put it on my website.
Okay. Yeah, because I'd like to know where to look for it. I think a lot of people would probably be interested in that. Hey, last thing. I know you're not political, and that's good for you. President Trump has said we need an iron dome like Israel has to protect against potential launches into the United States. And he kind of compared it to what President Reagan called the Star Wars initiative back in the 80s, which you know very well. That never really got off the ground, no pun intended. What would it take what kind of a system are we talking about? Is it satellite based where lasers or whatever diffuse or destroy bombs in the air? I don't even know, quite frankly, how Israel's Iron Dome actually works, but I do know that it picks off the overwhelming number of the rockets and missiles that are fired into Israel. What would it take for us to do that for a nation that is much, much larger than Israel?
I've lost my top secret clearance probably about 5 or 6 years ago, so I'm not clued in, and I wouldn't be able to talk about it if I did. But I sure would like to hope that we had some sort of defensive missile program that could shoot down incoming nuclear weapons, but probably we don't have enough to save us from all the nuclear weapons. And so, do I think we should have something like that? Man, I really do wish
Me too.
we had something like that because we're getting awfully close to a potential third nuclear war.
Yeah, and
Or,
even if it's not
a
nuclear.
world war, a
Oh,
world
right,
war.
right. Got it. A world war that would be the only nuclear war because it only takes one of those. And there's that, probably much more likely than an asteroid. There's your extinction event.
That's exactly right. That's
Because if
exactly
they
right.
pass one another, everything is off then. Um, just what was the other part I wanted to ask you about before we wrapped here? About war, about not nuclear, but what are your thoughts on EMPs? And because I don't, you're a tech guy, you're an engineer. EMP, uh, a lot of people feel like that might be if we are to be struck by one of our geopolitical rivals or enemies, and they really want to take us out without destroying the Earth, which a nuclear bomb would. That EMPs, of course, which would fry every circuit, within the range of the EMP, would be the way to do it. Is there a way to defend against that? Do you know much about those?
I do not know. That's out of my field. That's
Okay.
totally in the electrical engineering research area. You know, they had a great movie about that. I forgot the name of the movie that basically describes that kind of an event. But yeah, there are so many different ways we could be taken out with technology for cyber warfare, our infrastructure, and nuclear warfare.
Well, you're a smart guy. If I talk to you again in a couple months, you'll have all that researched up, right?
I doubt it. I
I'm
doubt
kidding.
it.
I'm
There's so
kidding.
many other things.
You retired for a reason. You to sit back now and write books like Mission Out of Control. Dr. Camarda, thank you. Fantastic conversation. I learned so much on this. And I want to advise everybody to go to the website again is what? Missionoutofcontrolbook.com?
That's correct. Yeah, or
Missionoutofcontrolbook.com.
charliecamarda.com.
We will throw that up on the screen as well as charliecamarda.com as well. There you go. Oh, look at there. There's the book again for you. All right. Well, Dr. Camarda, thank you for coming on. Thank you for being brutally honest about the state of the NASA program and the space program and so much of the culture that has changed that has put us in such a precarious position. I really appreciate your honesty.
Let me close by saying I love NASA, Bob. And my hope and prayers are that we could save NASA and we could save some of these other great agencies in this country.
You know what? You said it at the beginning that you love NASA, and it's appropriate that you close with it as well. I know you do. You're not saying any of these things to be mean spirited. You're saying these things because you love NASA and you want it to be fixed and you want it to get back to what it's supposed to be. And that's certainly respectful and
Thank you.
respectable. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for saying that.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. All right. Hey, want to tell everybody, thank you for watching. This is a very, very great episode. A lot of valuable information. Please watch it. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a like. Give us a subscribe, and share this with other people that you might that you think might enjoy it. I know I certainly did. Thanks for watching, Strictly Speaking, and we'll see you next time here on True Blue.